did you know that the U.S. produces 27 billion pounds of pork each year?
I did not, and it's kind of horrifying. I'm more of a veggie person. But I did know that schemes involving pig butchering are the cause of losses exceeding $75 billion globally.
No, so this is extraordinary. So this has been the topic of some, I think they're calling it now the Electronic Fraud Task Force meetings that I've been a part of that were open to the public. Pig butchering is by far one of the biggest things that the Secret Service and the FBI are responding to. And there was a very cool segment on the, I guess it's called Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, right? That was about this?
Yep.
And so when something gets to the point where an HBO weekly news show is covering it, I thought, I mean, you tell me, Kelly, I thought it was done with some compassion and some nuance.
Absolutely. One of the things that strikes me in these situations where we're talking about crime gangs and the people who are kind of on the ground level being the scammers, we often forget, again, like that emotional humanness, that element that's in there for most of them. And I really appreciated how they were able to show compassion not only for the victims, but also for some of the people who are forced into this life against their will.
So the basic structure that the HBO program with John Oliver kind of put out is common to those of us. And I think there was a long form article in Bloomberg about this too. There's been a couple of things recently in the popular press, but during the pandemic, some of these big casinos, at least in China and some other places in Asia, they changed their operation from being a live in-person casino to online scams.
Yeah.
What they're doing is, they text people, often Americans, and they develop a rapport and a relationship. And then, and only once they've developed that rapport, which turns out, this starts with being an accidental text, turns into a friendship, then turns into an exploitation. Then that's where they cash in. So how is this different from like the Nigerian prince fraud, Kayley?
Yeah, it's almost more insidious because there's this extra element to it where the people being the victims of this being scammed, there's no direct money exchanged between them and the scammer that they're forming this relationship with. Instead, they're directed to a separate app or platform that seems very legitimate. It'll have really solid ratings. It'll be verified in the Google Play Store or the Apple Store. By all accounts, it seems very legitimate. And then, boom, things start to turn in a different direction.
Yeah, and it's the part of the nuance here is that these aren't all hardened, intentional criminals who are on the other end of those text chats. The story went into some real detail in terms of some of the folks who are doing this are forced into doing it, right? They're either victims of human trafficking, or they're folks who are lured from one country to another country with the promise of a job, a legitimate job, often an online job, and their passport or other travel papers are held, and they're essentially forced to do it this way. And they're presented with these training manuals. They're presented with these online personas that they then adopt. And so if you get one of these highly detailed text messages like, "Hey, who are you?" or "Is this John from the bakery?" That's on the other end. That's a person who may be a victim of trafficking, not just somebody who's there directly to steal your money.
Yep. It's better at this point in time to just assume that someone not in your contact list sending you a random message is very likely attached to one of these pig butchering operations. I know sometimes it can be enticing to respond, kind of mess with someone a little bit, like in the old days of giving a wrong number. But because this is now the way these schemes start, it's honestly better to just tell your phone that it's junk, report it as junk, and delete the number entirely.
Yeah. And, as hard as it can be to approach with compassion these things, that was one takeaway that I had, which is instead of getting angry at the person, I get angry at the system that allows this to happen. And
Absolutely.
I know that doesn't do anything. I'm not solving any problem, but it does help me think about it in a way with a little more humanity than I probably had before.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, the bad guys who are behind these schemes are finding themselves more and more being tracked by law enforcement around the world, and particularly in the U.S. And we have with us a guest today who, for a large portion of his career, was actually behind some of that intelligence gathering and even some of those arrests. So I'm your host, Jack Clabby. I'm a cybersecurity attorney at Carlton Fields. And with me is Kayley Melton. Kayley's the vice president of U.S. remote publishing teams at KnowBe4. After a short break, we'll chat with Roman Sannikov. Roman is the president of Constellation Cyber. That's a boutique consulting firm, and they specialize in cyber threat intelligence. In addition to his cybersecurity work, Roman also serves as the secretary and the vice president of Helpster USA. That's a nonprofit dedicated to global healthcare access. We'll ask him about this and more when we return.
Welcome to No Password Required, a monthly conversation that introduces you to some of the top talent in the world of cybersecurity.
All right, so welcome back. Our guest today is Roman Sannikov. Roman, welcome to No Password Required.
Thank you. It's an honor.
So, Roman, I want to start with your current role, learn about that, and then we'll go back and I want to find out more about your career path and how you got to today. So what can you tell us about your role and what you do at Constellation Cyber?
Sure. So without sounding too promotional about it, Constellation Cyber is just basically my project. It's a consulting opportunity for me to work with companies, kind of both consuming threat intelligence on the client side, helping them use threat intelligence more productively, and at the same time working with some companies that have information and data that they collect as part of their overall work, and helping them turn that into an intelligence product and both improve their other product and also create this opportunity to share intelligence that could hopefully help with security in our environment in general. So that's an overall and the reason this is going to be a little corny, but the reason I call it Constellation is because over the years I got to meet a lot of really interesting people and really smart people, and one of the things that I really enjoy is kind of bringing these stars, so to speak, together. And really kind of connecting both individual contributors and opportunities. So that was one of the things I've always enjoyed. In terms of more specific things that I'm working on right now, primarily, so there's this thing out there that your listeners may have heard of. It's called ransomware, and it's not a very good thing. And there's a lot of really great people out there, both in the public sector and the private sector, that are trying to combat it. But one of the things that I've been really focused on for a while, really since the extortion sites came out, is really trying to bring that information to the world, because how do I put this without making anybody too upset? But a lot of times when an incident happens, the disclosure is not great. So unless it's PII, generally speaking, the victim organization is kind of told to just say that there was an incident, they're investigating it, they're dealing with it, they're handling it, but there's very little that is really useful that comes out of it. And, we've seen that, for example, with the major healthcare breach that just happened, where there was a lot of speculation in the community, in law enforcement, what exactly happened? Did they pay? Did they not pay? What exactly? And it's not super helpful, I think, to prevent the longer, wider spread of the negative impact. Obviously, I understand why the company might not want to disclose it, but that damages, so to speak, other entities that are associated with it. So one of the things I'm doing right now is helping secondary and tertiary victims. So maybe not the company that got ransomed, but the companies or the affiliates whose information was impacted by the leak. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, they don't know what is out there. And because, either for technical reasons, it's not very easy to download things off of Tor and analyze it. And a lot of times the stuff isn't collected in the most easy to analyze manner. But that's one of my main projects right now, again, is kind of processing some of that data and giving the opportunity to these other entities to really prepare and mitigate against future attacks and losses.
Yeah, that's great, because that's the hub and spoke of a ransomware attack, is that it's not just the data of the entity that got hit, but more and more frequently it radiates out to corporate customers of that entity, and then corporate customers of those corporate customers. Exactly. So you're already 2 steps away, and then finally consumers who may have known or may not have known that their data was being held by substrates and layers of other companies that were all making promises to one another as to the care of that data.
And we've seen that happen. We've seen it specifically with, again, not going into specific examples, but companies that, there was a company that reached out to me a while back saying, hey, we're getting hit with all of this really sophisticated phishing and spear phishing all of a sudden. What's going on? Our solutions are having a hard time keeping up with it. And so we had a conversation, and I asked them, were any of your affiliates recently ransomed? And they said no, but an affiliate or some part of an affiliate was ransomed, so kind of 2 steps removed. And so I said, well, there's a good chance that this may be part of the reason that you're getting hit with this sophisticated, because they know all of this communication. They basically consider it, all of this stuff leaked, read, processed by the bad guys. And sure enough, about 6 months later, they got hit with, I believe it was by the same crew that hit the company that was kind of 2 steps removed. So either they didn't follow my advice very carefully, or maybe it was just, again, maybe they didn't quite give it as much attention, because I basically said that they had to change their security posture vis-a-vis those entities radically, implement all sorts of multi-factor authentication, all that kind of stuff, because and so again, that's what I'm kind of trying to do, is help companies understand when they've been impacted by an incident at a different, supply chain or client, et cetera.
So so going back to the name Constellation Cyber, I like that, because there is that thought that in the intelligence community, we've got to jealously guard and protect our walls and what we get. And you're thinking about it from a different perspective, which is you're bringing this network together to help your clients and to help you're putting the walls down and you're making it more lateral than vertical, which makes a lot of sense.
Because I think ultimately the only way we can make a dent in this. You've seen, for example, the industry has grown by leaps and bounds. You go to RSA, you go to Black Hat, you get $1 trillion, you get these all. At the same time, the problem hasn't gone away. So somehow there's a lot more money, there's a lot more really awesome tools out there. And so you would think that things would be getting better, but in a lot of ways, I don't think they have. And so I think the only way we can really make some sort of a difference is if we do have this kind of more collaborative approach and more transparent approach, and not about kind of CYA, but really about protecting, the whole environment.
So to be good at this, you have to know what you're looking for, know how to look for it, and have contacts and people you can call on to help. This must have taken a lot of effort to build. So maybe you can kind of, Roman, walk us through your career, sort of like how did you first get into this, and then kind of take us through what took you to here.
Yeah, I kind of backed into this career, to be honest with you. I started out as an interpreter. I worked for about 25 years as an interpreter and translator, doing a lot of really fun stuff. But one of my primary clients for about 21 years of that time was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and Department of Justice, a couple of other, but primarily the FBI. And about a third of my time kind of through my 21-year stint, I got called into a cyber investigation. And it was not technically my first one, but the first one where I was really embedded in the investigation.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons was because kind of in the 90s and the 2000s, you really had the explosion of Russian-speaking, not necessarily Russian geographically, but Russian-speaking individuals and these various forums and platforms. And I was, at that time, I believe, the youngest and the most computer savvy, which is kind of sad, translator at the FBI. I think a lot of the people there were not very comfortable with computers at all.
Okay.
At least in the translator space, a lot of work was still being done kind of on typewriter, believe it or not.
That's awesome.
So
it's a more secure. It's a more secure way of writing things down. To be fair,
it is actually, yes. But so that was how I wound up getting into cyber, and then I realized that this was actually really cool because you got to be really embedded in this. And my first investigation was related to the Bloomberg LLP and a hack of that organization. It was really pretty ingenious, and it was done by a Russian-speaking individual in the country of Kazakhstan. And so I actually got to travel to Kazakhstan a couple of times to help the prosecutors and the agents collect information from our Kazakh counterparts, and also got to work with Kazakh investigators as they came over to the United States and brought evidence to help the prosecution of this individual in the United States. So it was really fun.
Roman, just as an aside, we've talked on the program before about the U.S. legal attaches who are resident in foreign countries. Did you get to meet and hang out with some of them? And are they as cool as we've heard?
I did, and I take credit. I won't name the individual, but I actually take credit for at least one later becoming an ALAT
nice.
Because they enjoyed the trip. I'm a kind of just a natural born tour guide, so wherever I go, I wind up taking people around, and even if it's not necessarily a place that I've been to before, I just read up so much that I'm like, okay, we got to check this out. And he had such a good time that he subsequently went and became kind of a career legal attaché at various Russian-speaking cities and countries. So it was I was very proud of that.
I imagine being a Russian-speaking attaché is a pretty intense job.
These days, yeah, I think it was a little bit more chill back then. I think we were on friendlier terms. But yeah, I'm sure now it's a little bit tricky,
to say the least.
So at Constellation, you're promoting now a more holistic approach to cybersecurity. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and how this holistic approach, contrasts with kind of what we were talking about, the siloed approach that some folks still take?
I don't have a product, so to speak, so I'm not pushing a specific solution to things. I really believe that a lot of it has to do with education, and a lot of it has to do with education both of the company hierarchy, of company employees, of consumers, and customers. The way I look at it, and people who know me probably have gotten tired of me using this analogy, but if you're an employee of a shop in a mall or something like that, at the end of the day, you'll probably count the money in the cash register. You'll put it away in the safe. You'll lock up. You'll set the alarm. You'll maybe lock the doors, all that kind of stuff. None of that is because you are a part of the security team. Overtly, you're not part of the security team, but it's something that has intrinsic intrinsically been trained in us as part of, being an employee, these basic levels of security, maybe checking the $50 bill that you get. So these things, and nobody really pushes back against that. That's part of being an employee, is going through this kind of basic hygiene. But when it comes to cybersecurity, there's like this kind of ethos that it's somehow the responsibility of these kind of, I'll make fun of myself here, but like these troglodytes that sit in the server closet somewhere, never see the light of day, and that they're the ones that are responsible for the security. Meanwhile, we, as users, we don't know what to do. We don't know what decisions to make, etc. So I really think that until everybody, and that's kind of what I think about when I think of holistically, until it becomes everyone's responsibility. So whether it's through training, through incentives, through maybe in some cases punitive measures. I mean, you don't want to fire people, but at the same time, you do want to have a level of responsibility if somebody does something really stupid. So I think there has to be the situation. And conversely, and that's kind of like when I think on the consumer side, the people who are not experts. Conversely, I think we as people who are in the industry, I think we have to be more open to educating, more open to, I don't want to say dumbing things down, but making things accessible of what we do, why we do, how we do it. I recently posted some stuff about pig butchering, or fraud in general. Some people unfortunately kind of still said, listen, there's been so much written about this that if somebody still gets hit with this, then it's kind of like their own stupidity. And this is the same stuff that I heard literally 20 plus years ago when we were working with, it was an interesting case when we were working with Russia where they had identified some individuals who were involved in romance scams in Russia, and they were trying to get people in the West, law enforcement, to file complaints. And I remember talking to people in Texas and a couple of other places, law enforcement, and they were like, hey, so these guys sent, I'm not going to do my Texas drawl here. I don't want to offend anyone, but, these guys sent $4,000 to some Natasha in Russia. That'll be the lesson for them. So they should be grateful that it wasn't more. And that was the attitude.
But that's the problem. It's like we all know how to drive cars, but car accidents still happen. It's right. You're going to still, the reason it works is because of innate human nature, and you can decrease the amount of it, but getting it to zero or blaming victims. And we also know, Roman, like we know what blaming victims does. Blaming victims just drives it down deeper and burrows them further and makes it harder for us to identify and find people who are willing to speak out about it. That's what we know what happens.
Yeah. So essentially, that's kind of what my approach is to the holistic, is really kind of hopefully foster collaboration and communication within our industry and not be so protective of what we found and what we, again, in threat intelligence, I can say, we're guilty of this a lot of times. It's all about we have the access, we're the ones that know about this thing. And a lot of times, everybody has similar access, so it's kind of like the race to be first to say something, not always to be right. But again, kind of the idea of collaborating, because we talk a lot about fighting the same fight, but we don't always kind of walk that walk.
Yeah, it's interesting to me where the line gets drawn between being competitive and withholding versus being collaborative and open.
It's tricky. I'm not a millionaire. I haven't, built one of these companies that's gone, through the roof. So I'm not going to criticize individuals. Obviously, they know more than I do. But in terms of if we want to make a difference for, again, for the industry and in the fight against cyber threats, I think we have to improve our level of collaboration.
So, Roman, many people work their way through college taking side jobs like serving ice cream or landscaping. You had a little bit of a different path there where you were doing contract work for the FBI. How did you balance being a student with these, I don't want to say clandestine, but other pursuits that were non-traditional?
It was tricky. Well, one of the first times when I first realized that it was going to be tricky was towards the end of my security clearance. They had basically made it implied that I was pretty much done. I just have to come in for an interview, and I was so excited because, again, as a college student, I'm like, hey, I'm getting my first real job, and it's not flipping burgers and things like that. And I also I was like proud of the fact that the FBI was bringing me on. So I told all my friends, even some people who weren't my friends, that I was going to be working for the FBI as a contractor. And then I show up at the interview and I go through everything. At the end, the gentleman says, okay, so by the way, you're not to tell anyone that you're working with the FBI. And I'm like, wow, somebody could have mentioned that a little bit earlier, because I think like everyone and their mother pretty much knows that I'm going to be working with the FBI. Awesome. And so he gets this very pained look on his face, and he says, okay, well, tell them that you're going to be doing a clerical position. Don't tell them that you're going to be in it. And so I'm like, okay, so I'm dropping out of college, where I'm doing fairly well, to take a clerical position with the FBI. That's not going to sound suspicious at all.
You're just very passionate and aspirational.
Yes, exactly. I love my country so much that I want to, just drop my. So, but that was the beginning where I realized that it was going to be a little tricky. I had some really interesting reinvestigations in the bureau. You get these like 5-10 year, theoretically it's supposed to be 5, sometimes it's a little longer, reinvestigations to make sure you haven't become a security risk. And some of the people that they send out to interview, your friends and colleagues and all that, are not the most subtle people in the world. And so, one of my friends from college friend called me in a panic saying that, he was afraid that he'd just like ruin my career because they asked him if I did drugs. And he said no, but he is kind of fond of vodka. And so the agent, he happened to live in Utah. He moved to Salt Lake City. Okay. And he said, I think the agent like really freaked out. I think she took this really seriously, that I was that you, he's speaking to me, are having an alcohol problem. And so I calmed him down. I said that a lot of times these are just like new agents that are doing this stuff. So I think I'm going to be okay. But there was some fun times. Yeah. But one of the other, if I have a second, one of the other fun incidents was when the first birthday that I spent with my the young lady who is now my wife, it was her birthday. I was stuck in the back of a van in the middle of summer in Brooklyn doing surveillance of a meet with someone who was collaborating with us after having been arrested, and was meeting with some Russian gangsters at a diner in Brooklyn. And they wanted to make sure, because I guess there was a bounty out on this guy's head. They wanted to make sure that nothing horrible was going to happen. So the problem is that it's Brooklyn, it's the middle of summer, and all the agents, this was a joint FBI, IRS, they're all sitting in comfortable vehicles several blocks away in air conditioning. I have to sit right next to this diner because back then the technology was a little bit more limited, so the range was a little bit more limited, and the van has to be off. And it has to be sealed completely. So this IRS van, what they do is they put ice in it and they turn the fans on from the battery. So at least there's like some circulation in there. Unfortunately, nobody remembered to bring the ice. So when I actually showed up at my wife's birthday, kind of like celebration, I don't think there was a dry spot on my body. because it was I literally looked like I had just gone through the rinse cycle, but the person was not killed or harmed. So in the end, my job was done well.
That's incredible, Roman. That's awesome. We also understand that one of your adventures with the FBI was that at one point you became or were the moderator on a major Russian language underground forum. How did that come about?
So that was an interesting case. And it's actually one of the things that's a little tough. People don't really think about it too much, but when you're taking on somebody's persona and when you're on these places, you are doing undercover type of work. So even though you're working with agents and stuff, but really it's you who's interacting with the bad guys. And obviously, I wasn't Serpico, I wasn't in mortal danger and things like that. And for those in the audience who know who Serpico was, that was a little bit before most people's time, but still. But you do have to ingratiate yourself to people. You have to kind of seem authentic. You have to build relationships with people, knowing that you're working against them. So for most people, it is difficult. And I've been the boss of a lot of people later on in life in managerial positions. And a lot of times people find it difficult. A lot of people in the industry, they're they're lurkers. They monitor what's happening. But to really get information, you have to be able to interact with people. You have to be able to, kind of conduct deals. Yeah. And a lot of times those deals aren't going to happen because they're illegal, and you're going to be kind of pulling the plug at a certain point. But it's tough. Unless you're kind of really good or pathological, then it's tough. Even though these people are doing something wrong, and in some cases they are really bad people, not always, but in some cases. But it's still difficult, I think, for most people to kind of build a close working relationship with somebody, knowing that you're trying to get them in trouble and stuff like that. So, we see a lot of these movies, and we don't really think about that, but it is kind of tough. Yeah.
So what was the transition like for you as you took over that account?
Well, the gentleman was arrested. He wasn't super happy, but we kind of convinced him to collaborate. I won't go into all the details of the process, but there was some issues because there were several different agencies involved in the arrest, and the agencies weren't always on the same page about what was going to happen. So a lot of times I kind of had to smooth over some of the bumps in the road that people were kind of going through when they were making the decision. Are we going to say, excuse my language, F you to the government, or are we going to say, okay, we're going to collaborate and try to get ourselves a 5K letter, but eventually, again, the person wasn't thrilled about it. But what would happen is they would bring him out of prison on a regular basis. We would sit there together for several months, and I would kind of shoulder surf him, and then after a while, I would do the interaction and he would shoulder surf me and make kind of comments about what I was doing right, what I was doing wrong. Over time, I think that my persona evolved a little bit differently from what his had been, just because but I did it gradually enough that I don't think I just say, as far as I know, I didn't lose. I think, well, I shouldn't say that. We did lose one individual, but that wasn't my fault. That was because of some operational decisions that were made by the Bureau. I think they kind of pushed things a little bit too quickly. But overall, I was able to maintain that persona for, something like 8 years. It was it was also, again, stressful because agents come and go, but you maintain that continuity. New agents come in, you explain to them, what this is, what the different accesses you have are, what the benefits, what the drawbacks is. And also, you can't exactly maintain banker's hours if you're, posing as a criminal. So there was a lot of weekends. Again, my wife was very understanding, a lot of late nights that I had to spend on various forums, dealing with people's bad behavior and kicking people out and giving them warnings and stuff like that.
What constitutes bad behavior on a forum like this?
It's really funny. For some reason, Russian language forums, they have this thing about cursing. So even though there's a lot of cursing, but at the same time, at some point, a moderator or an admin or somebody will just go off and we'll just start giving bans and stuff for people using, questionable lexical choices and stuff like that. So, but normally, there were things, one of the things you really have to look out for is clone accounts. I could probably talk about this for hours, but the whole point behind forums is you need a place where inherently untrustworthy individuals who don't know each other can figure out a way to work together and to trust each other. Mm-hmm. And the way they can do that is by reputation, by not ripping people off and stuff like that. Now, if you create multiple accounts on a forum, then you can start vouching for yourself under those accounts. So that was one of the things that was the trickiest, is try to identify individuals who were, somehow not what they appeared and maybe controlling multiple accounts and stuff like that. And then, there are a lot of people who do, exit scams or rip other people off or maybe have some sort of dispute. Obviously, you see that a lot with legitimate business as well, having disputes. So that's the kind of stuff that I had to deal with as well.
Roman, kind of given your experience and your clearances, you must have translated for a lot of global leaders over the years. What do you allow yourself to learn from those moments? What's that like?
Yeah, a lot of times I kind of felt like Zelig or Forrest Gump or something. In your head, you're still a little kid, and you're like, wow, how am I standing next to, I got to interpret for Eric Holder for a little bit, who was just the sweetest person, one of the sweetest people I'd met. We were walking through the Hermitage, and I was part of his security detail. And all of a sudden, a bunch of older Japanese people kind of ran up to him and were like, "Oh my God, you're!" And the Russian security detail and the American were kind of like trying to usher him along, and he's like, "No, no, no!" He's shaking hands with all these people, so those were really interesting. I think those are some of the takeaways, is to not lose your humanity in the midst of all of this. And I think the people who are most successful are the ones who don't forget that there's people out there that depend on what we do. And I think that's kind of one of the big lessons that I took away from some of the people that I really admired.
Some of the things that, given what you were doing, I imagine that a lot of the investigations ended up not going to an arrest because it got taken care of on another part of the government over there, but that some did end with arrests, which is pretty cool given the kind of crime that you all were investigating, that you were able to prosecute folks. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about a memorable arrest maybe that you were a part of?
Sure. Actually, one of the more memorable arrests was the individual, and hopefully he won't be mad at me for talking about this, but we're actually friends. It's been many years, and he's kind of done his time. But he was the founder of Gozi, which was one of the first Trojans that used the rental model. So before that, a lot of Trojans were sold. and so that allowed law enforcement and researchers to decompile it, to analyze it, and things like that. So this was one of those situations where he figured out that, hey, I'm just going to rent it and I'm just going to target it, and so he was quite successful, and he had like limited clients, but he was a really interesting guy, and he was had an interesting background, really smart, quite young, started several companies, including several legitimate companies, and was actually in the U.S. for a legitimate project that he was doing, and was in California in the Bay Area for something organized by Google, I believe. It was many years ago, but I believe that's what it was. And we arrested him kind of in the middle of him. I think he was online at the time. It was like 11 or 12 o'clock at night, and obviously he wasn't happy, but he was considered such a big get that we actually got the director's jet. The director of the FBI jet came out, picked us up, and flew us back to New York from California. And the agents were like, so this was actually, I believe, my second time in the director's jet. I did have another flight in there, but the first time was with the director, so that was even more fun.
That's incredible.
But this time, and I remember the agents were like, wow, this is so cool. We're flying in the director's jet. And he was like, he's so grim. He was a young man, I think like 23 at the time. He's like, the fact that they sent out this jet to pick me up means that this is going to be bad for me. This is that they spent so much time and effort on this. This is not going to be something that's going to be a slap on the wrist. And he did work with us for a few years, and then he did spend some time in prison, and then he's been released and he's living overseas now. And I'm happy to say that he's actually a productive member of society, has put all of that behind him, and is quite successful, has a family, and he actually has helped some individuals around the war in Ukraine. So I'm very happy that, and I think maybe this is kind of megalomaniacal on my part, but I think that I take a little bit of the credit in him turning his life around. I remember I was I think the only person that would go visit him in prison afterwards. And it's actually after I left the bureau and he was there. But he really appreciated that, and that I hadn't kind of given up on him. And he was such a smart person. And so I even wrote a letter to the judge saying, look, it would be a loss to lock somebody up like this for a long time, because he can do. And like I said, he has done some positive things since he's so I'm happy that I was part of that.
Yeah, that's something that with so much of what we talk about in this community around sophisticated online crime is that the same skills that make someone good at that, responsiveness, diligence, group organization, are the same things that make a person successful in traditional legal businesses. And but for a step here or a step there, someone could be there. And it's good to think that even if you take a step to the left as opposed to a step to the right, you can still get back on the path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not naive enough to say that all of these people just are in this situation because they come from poverty and come from horrible backgrounds. That's not the case. I mean, there are some people that I interacted with who just were not pleasant people,
No doubt.
but there were the majority of the people that I interacted with made a mistake, but they weren't unredeemable. I think a lot of the people, after they did their time, or some people, did other things to kind of fix the situation. But a lot of them subsequently became really successful in the industry. So fighting further, cyber attacks and cyber crime, or outside of the industry, as this young man kind of stepped away from it completely, doing a lot of other things. And I think that's one of the things that I think sometimes is a little, going back to the question of holistic, is we don't always talk about the human beings behind these attacks. And a lot of times there's like this idea of, like lock them up and throw away the key, and all this stuff. And I actually think that, sometimes you may need to do that, but I don't think that should be the first response to this. And I think also just understanding why people do things to really, I think probably, this is one of those things that Machiavelli or Tsing Tu or someone said this, that, you really need to understand your enemy and get into their head to be able to counter them.
Yeah. And Roman, on this point, we're going to take a break in a quick moment, but we do want to ask you about Helpster USA. Can you tell us about that and about your role with Helpster?
Sure. So this is actually, this goes back to Nikita, who is the young man who I arrested in California about 15 years ago or so. But he's a successful businessman now, and he actually helped found or helped sponsor this organization. It's an organization that is dedicated to providing life-saving or life-altering treatment to young. It's primarily people, I believe, under 21, all over the world, primarily in developing economies. So they have offices in Nigeria, Kenya, Cambodia. And really what it focuses on is that there's a lot of kids who are literally dying because they or their parents can't afford surgery that's $300, $400, $500.
Yeah.
So this is a thing that's mind blowing. And when he told me about this, it was really something that they needed someone who could be part of their board in the United States. And so I jumped on that opportunity because, it just boggles the mind that we live in an environment where you can save a life literally, not, over time, but right now you can save a life by donating, or collecting $300-$400 in some of these countries. And so that's what Helpster does is they identify cases, they vet to make sure that the money is going to the hospital and is doing for the surgery, and they provide supportive the other thing is, not to get too political, but a lot of the people who are working there are people who have kind of escaped Russia. And so with being from Russia and seeing a lot of the horrible things that are associated with Russia right now, justifiably so, it's really helps me morally and emotionally that there are Russians out there who are dedicating themselves to really helping people and making positive change in the world.
That's great.
That's beautiful.
Thank you, Roman. We're going to take a short break now, and when we return, the Lifestyle Polygraph. Stay with us.
You're listening to the No Password Required podcast. We cover cybersecurity and a lot of other stuff.
Welcome back. As many of you know, the Lifestyle Polygraph is a test used by the federal government to determine if a person is worthy of learning some of our nation's most important secrets. Here, we use this technique for slightly lower stakes to determine whether our guest can join our fantasy cybersecurity squad. Roman, are you ready for our Lifestyle Polygraph?
I hope so.
Me too. All right. Number 1. During your career, you've done some translating work for NHL hockey teams, and many rumors call out NHL players as being some of the most eccentric in the sports world. Do you have any firsthand evidence that could confirm these rumors for us?
I can't say they're the most eccentric because I haven't met a lot of people from other sports. I can say that it's interesting because they're both very down to earth in a lot of ways, but at the same time, they are very quirky, particularly goalies. My son is actually a goalie. He plays at a fairly high level. Cool. They are a breed apart, and they will frequently talk to the goalposts around them,
Really?
thank them for or for when the puck when they miss the puck but it goes off the post. So you'll see them standing there in net and having a conversation. My son, when they play music between stoppages, sometimes without being conscious, he's there dancing, to some heavy metal and stuff like that. And it's just so they are very different. So I would say that I don't know if they're the most eccentric, but they're definitely up there.
We have a Russian goalkeeper in Tampa, Florida, Andrei Vasilevsky, who is exactly that character. He's 6'11", butterflies himself, and everyone loves him so much with all their heart. And I don't want to know what he's like in real life, because I just have this. We all have this image of him as just being the most wondrous guy. But around the time when they won the cup, I mean, when he was walking around, he had like a little kid, and it was just such a wonderful, wholesome thing. So, but he does this thing with his eyes where he backs up, and he does that. He has his eccentric moments. So we're happy to have our local eccentric cool guy between the pipes.
I understand that burden. I'm a bassist, so we're also stereotypically eccentric.
Yes.
That's awesome. If there's leftover food, don't worry, the bassist will finish it. Is that kind of a comment? Like stuff like that. I don't know. Kayley will get it later.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll take care of it. All right. So earlier you described yourself as kind of like a Forrest Gump style character. Can you give us an example of your life being like the proverbial box of chocolates?
Boy, there's been so many instances where something unexpected has happened. I've come across people who I never expected to come across in various environments, both for better or for worse. One time I was coming back from this was when I was with the FBI. I was coming back from a side gig. I used to joke with the FBI saying that the only way I could afford to work for the FBI and live in New York was by taking a lot of side gigs and stuff like that. So I was there. It was February, I think it was around 1999, and I was dressed in my finest suit coming back from a law office where I was interpreting for a legal deposition. And my boss pulls me in and says, "Hey, there's an incident that happened on the high seas. There's a ship coming in, and I think they think that there was a murder.
God.
Would you be willing to go check this out, because it's a Ukrainian ship and they all speak Russian on this ship." This may sound a little sexist, but he was like, most of the other translators at the time there were female and were older. And he's like, "I would feel more comfortable if you had to go meet with these people for you to do it." And so I'm like, sure, I've never been aboard a cargo ship, and why not? And so we sat there until it was like 2 or 3 in the morning, because it took forever for this thing to come in, and it was sleeting, and it was February, and the ship wound up being stopping. It was a big cargo ship under the Verrazano Bridge, so it's out there in the bay, and we take a little NYPD boat out to this ship, and they're arguing about, should we go up, should we not go up, because people don't want to climb up this in the middle of the night with like hail coming down.
Fair enough.
And then some of the agents having their like combat gear, and they're like, we don't really want to climb 4 stories in this. But at some point they're like, well, I think one of the NYPD guys said, "Look, if there's a dead body up there, my captain is going to have my hide if I don't at least see what's going on." And they're arguing about who's going to go up. And so finally, and this wasn't because of bravery or anything, but it was just I was starting to get a little kind of annoyed. I'm like, "Look, guys, whoever goes up, I have to go up, because without me, nothing's going to happen." And so I volunteer to go up first. And I go up to this rope ladder about 4 stories up, and the guy on the NYPD boat says, "Okay, so you climb up about 10 steps, you loop your hands around it, so you're not climbing with your hands facing forward, you're climbing with your hands kind of facing towards you, and then you go up about 10 steps, and they have to like pull the ladder away because it was frozen to the ship.
Crazy.
And he goes, "We're going to back up away from you." And I'm like, "Whoa, what do you mean you're going to back up away from me? There's water underneath me." And he goes, "Well, if you slip and fall in the water, we'll fish you out. If you slip and fall on the boat, chances are you'll break your back."
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, I still don't feel comfortable with this, but at least
Oh
I
my
understand
goodness.
the rationale behind it. And so I climb up to the top finally, and this kind of wizened old face shows up and weather beaten. And he looks at me and he's like, he doesn't know what to say because he doesn't speak English. And so I say, my politest, Russian, I'm like, "Good evening, pleasure. I'm your interpreter. How can I help?" And so just the his face lit up, and just like everybody gathered around me, they pulled me over, and it was a really obviously it was a sad incident. The captain of the ship committed suicide. He wasn't killed, but he committed suicide because the ship had been traveling for a very long time, for some like 6 months, and they weren't used to these long. Usually, they only sailed in the Black Sea for a couple of months, and they weren't getting paid. The owner of the ship was kind of stalling with a payment, and so it was a very stressful situation. So he committed suicide,
Wow.
so obviously it's sad, but it was such an interesting experience that I certainly had no idea I was going to be I was going to be climbing in my suit and expensive shoes when I left my house that morning. So yeah, that was
awesome.
definitely one of those interesting chocolates.
Yeah. Perfect anecdote. I mean, that deserves to be a movie all in itself. I mean, from the start to the finish is like, there's been a murder.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Next question. Can you tell us what it means to be an avid mushroomer? And could you share the highlights of a satisfying day spent exploring and collecting mushrooms?
Yes, so that's actually one of my big hobbies. It's a great way to spend time outdoors. Whenever I used to say that I was a mushroomer, everybody, people can't see me. For those who haven't seen the picture, I could pass for an old-time hippie, and so people used to always assume that when I talked about mushrooms, I talked about the magic mushrooms. Sadly, I've never actually found any magic mushrooms, so I guess I'm not looking in the right cow patties. But growing up in Ukraine and in Russia, it was one of those things. So my parents used to take me out a lot, and it's really fun because you're walking around, you're looking, and all of a sudden you find this little gem. I can't say that I know all mushrooms, but I've never been poisoned, and I know the ones that we collect. And it's just anytime you find mushrooms in quantity, it's pretty satisfying. I mentioned my son. He's actually taking a gap year, living in Finland this year, playing some hockey over there. But in the fall, we went on a trip with him to a town, and I just slammed on the brakes in the middle of this county highway, and I'm like, "Oh my God, those are mushrooms!" And I pulled over, and I backed up, and these mushrooms were huge. I mean, some of the mushrooms, I have pictures. They were literally like the hat was about a foot across,
Wow.
and they were great because the slugs hadn't gotten to them, none of the little things got to them, and they were really good. And so the rest of my visit, I spent drying these mushrooms because I couldn't eat all of them at once, so I wanted them drying them for future consumption. But that was a really fun time. And even my son, who's not a huge mushroom fan, but he had a good time pointing out the various mushrooms. So it was a very satisfying experience.
That's so cool. Yeah, it really is kind of magical when you stumble upon one and you've been searching for a while. All right, next question. The best days at work always include blank.
The best days of work. I mean, whenever you have a client, a customer, whatever it may be, that has a bit of a kind of a eureka moment and saying like, wow, this really like helped me figure something out, helped me understand something, that is, I don't want to sound like I'm some sort of like holier than thou individual, but whenever you're, because I'm in the service industry, like I'm helping people. That's the way I look at it. And whenever you have that, somebody's eyes light up, or somebody's like, or their shoulders relax because they're like, see a path towards something positive, that is a really good moment. Conversely, sometimes, you see people getting really not angry, but really upset and nervous. But sometimes that's a good thing too, because you're letting them know that there's something they should be concerned about that maybe they had no idea about before. A lot of times when people were like, for a long time, people didn't understand. People, in C-level, I mean, I had CISOs ask me, so what's the big deal when some of our credentials are being sold on Russian market or Genesis? And I had to go and explain to them why that was a bad thing. And then you see all of a sudden things light up, and it's not a good thing for them, but at least you get the sense, okay, now they get the magnitude of the threat, and now maybe they'll make some decisions that will help them remediate that. So whenever you make a change in something in the right direction, that's a good day.
That's cool.
Yeah, I agree. I can relate to that. That's a good answer. All right, final question.
Okay.
What is something that took you some time to learn after moving overseas?
Well, I still haven't quite figured out baseball. So I've been to a few games. I still haven't quite gotten it down yet. But honestly, when I first came to America, I think it was the politeness. But at the same time, and I don't want to be one of these people who's kind of like, oh, Americans are all fake. That's not at all what I mean. But, when people would stop you and be like, how are you? And, the expected is like, I'm doing okay, fine, blah, blah, blah. But, when somebody asked me, as you could probably tell, I like talking, I would be like, well, since you've asked. And so there's this little kid, telling these adults, and you see, after a while you start realizing, wait a second, I think I may be taking a little bit more time than I was meant to in terms of this. But it took me a while to figure out that when somebody says, how are you, they don't literally mean how are you. It's just a polite way of saying that they care, so they're hoping that you're doing well.
It's not a question. It's just a well wish, right? It's just an opportunity for them to connect with that.
Exactly.
Well, Roman, thank you so much for joining us today on the No Password podcast. If our listeners want to get in touch with you, is that okay to do? And if so, how can they connect with you?
Sure, absolutely. I am very accessible. I think that's one of the things I try to be. I've had, again, not to sound like holier than thou, but I had a lot of people ping me on LinkedIn who were just breaking into the industry, and I always try to chat with them, because throughout my life I've gotten a lot of help. The only reason I'm here is because a lot of good people have given me a hand up, and so if I can ever do that. So feel free to ping me on LinkedIn. My website is still being redone, but you can also email me at roman@constellationcyber.net, and I do try to respond to everyone. If you're selling me something, I'm probably not in your market yet. I'm not generating, $1 million in ARR. So you might want to hold off for a little bit. But if you have a question or you want to, run something by me, I'm more than happy to chat.
Thank you, Roman.
Thank you. This is really a pleasure.
That brings us to the end of the show. But first, Kayley, what did you learn today?
I learned that no matter what role you're taking in this hugely varied industry, staying in touch with your own humanity and a sense of gratitude can really take you through anything. It just helps everyone involved in the process, and it helps you. I don't know. It just helps everyone. It's just nice. It's a nice thing to do.
Yeah, Roman is somebody who's doing it the right way, for sure.
Yeah.
What it looks like. One thing I learned is that if I'm ever called upon to board a large ship from a smaller boat, step one, the hands go reverse.
Yes.
The normal rope ladder technique. And two, you have the boat back up a little bit so that if you fall, you don't break your back. So that was incredible. That's exactly what I was hoping that his adventures were like, and they were like that. So I'm glad he survived it all in one piece to tell his story to us and be in the position he is to help so many on the cyber front.
Yep.
For the entire No Password Required team, I'm Jack Clabby with Kayley Melton, and thank you for listening, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you for listening to the No Password Required podcast. You can find us on social media at No Password Pod. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the No Password Required podcast. And if you know someone who might like it, please share it with them. The show is produced by Cyber Florida. And a special thank you goes out to our friends at Carlton Fields. If you'd like to learn more, visit our website, cyberflorida.org/pod. All opinions expressed by the No Password Required podcast participants are their own and do not exclusively represent the views and opinions of Cyber Florida.